All right, get ready, because today we are going deep with a legend, really. Noam Chomsky.
Oh, good one.
Yeah, we're diving into some lectures, specifically from 1979.
Okay.
And the focus here is this idea of government and binding. Now, I know,
The topic.
right, it can sound a bit intimidating at first, but trust me,
Oh, yeah.
it's worth sticking with us. Because I think, maybe...
Yeah, these lectures.
Yeah, these
to
lectures,
bring you.
they're like a master class. A master class on how language actually works, how it really works. We're going way beyond just,
The basics.
yeah, like the basic grammar rules we all learned in school.
Right, right. I mean, what's so cool about these lectures is that Chomsky wasn't just, trying to describe how sentences are structured on the surface.
Right.
You know what I mean? He was after the blueprint, the hidden system that makes it all possible in the first place.
Almost like cracking the code.
Yeah, exactly. Like the code of human communication.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is this idea of universal grammar. UGU. It's like the idea that we humans, we're born with this ability for language.
Oh, yeah. Like a linguistic instinct.
Exactly. And from that starting point, he digs into all these subsystems like binding theory, case theory, control theory, all these pieces.
Okay, so yeah, let's try to unpack some of these subsystems here. Binding theory, I feel like I remember hearing about that back in college.
Oh, it's a classic.
But it's a bit hazy for me now.
Well, so binding theory, it's all about how different parts of a sentence relate to each other,
Okay.
specifically pronouns,
Yeah.
how they connect back to nouns, their antecedents.
Right.
So like the classic example, John saw himself in the mirror. Binding theory explains why himself has to refer back to John and not somebody else.
Ah, okay, got it. So
Yeah.
it's all about making sure the pronouns are linked up correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what about case theory? I always thought that was just about, uppercase and lowercase letters.
Right. Well, in linguistics, case is a whole other ballgame.
Okay.
It's about how languages mark grammatical roles. Subject, object, right.
Right.
Like in English, we use word order a lot to signal those roles.
Yeah,
So the dog chased the cat means something different from the cat chased the dog.
right, totally.
And case theory explains the rules behind that.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but how they relate to each other.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, Chomsky points out how some sentences just sound wrong,
Oh, for sure.
even if the word order seems okay,
Yes.
Like you can say, it seems that John is happy, but you can't say it was forced to rain.
Yeah. No,
It's just wrong.
it just sounds so wrong.
And that's where case theory comes in.
Okay.
It reveals this deeper logic. It explains why some structures work and others don't.
Uh-oh.
It all comes down to the verbs,
Got it.
seem versus force, and how they assign case.
So case theory is like a secret decoder ring for figuring out these grammatical mysteries.
Right. And, Chomsky was always skeptical of concepts that couldn't be linked to actual language data.
Yeah.
Like, he was always pushing the field to base theories on real evidence. You know what I mean?
So he wasn't just making things up in his head. He was looking at how people actually use language.
Right. One of his big ideas that we see in these lectures is the projection principle.
Okay.
And this principle, it basically states that sentence structure, it comes from the words we use.
So it's not just abstract rules, it's about how those rules interact with the actual words we choose.
Exactly. For example, like, John wants Bill to win, and John believes that Bill will win.
Mm-hmm.
They look pretty similar, but they have different underlying structures
Yeah.
because of the verbs want and believe.
The verbs are kind of like the bosses of the sentence.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So now, get ready. We're going to jump into this wild concept of empty categories,
Oh, yeah.
which are parts of sentences that aren't actually spoken or written, but they still matter for meaning.
It's kind of mind-bending, right?
Almost like linguistic ghosts or something.
In a way, yeah. Take the example. John was persuaded to leave. It doesn't explicitly say who persuaded John, but we still get it.
Yeah, you just fill in that blank.
Right. And that's where empty categories come in. Chomsky explains this using what's called PRO
PRO.
and control theory.
Okay.
So PRO is like a placeholder for that unmentioned persuader.
It's like the invisible stagehand.
Exactly. And control theory explains how we figure out who PRO refers to.
But how do we know? Like, how do we know who that PRO should be?
Now that is the question. And that's exactly what Chomsky dives into in these lectures. He gives specific examples of how control theory operates across different sentence types.
Wow, so there's this whole hidden level to language that we don't even realize.
Right, and this is just the start. He explores 3 types of empty categories, each with their own quirks and jobs to do. There's PRO, we just talked about. But then you've got trace, which is left behind when words move in a sentence.
Right.
And then a special empty NP that pops up in certain grammatical structures.
Wow. So it's not just words and sentences, it's like this web of relationships and hidden elements.
Yeah. Like one of those magic eye pictures,
Yeah.
You got to look beyond the surface to see the real image.
I love that. I feel like I'm seeing language in a totally new way.
Exactly. And trust me, Chomsky was a master at uncovering those layers.
Wow. I already feel like I'm looking at language differently, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Can't wait to dive even deeper into these concepts.
Well, hold on tight because it gets even more interesting.
Yeah.
Next time, we're going to see how these empty categories mess with case theory.
Oh, wow.
Which leads to some really surprising stuff about the structure of language.
Can't wait. This is like a linguistic treasure hunt, and I'm all in for the adventure.
Let's go.
So we're in this world of empty categories now, and it's kind of mind-bending, you know?
It is a bit of a paradox.
It really is.
But that's what's so cool about Chomsky, right?
Yeah.
He makes you rethink how language works. Like, there's so much more than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
It's not just what we see and hear.
So you mentioned how these empty categories, they connect to case theory. Right. Can you maybe break that down a little more for me?
Sure. So case theory is all about how languages mark these grammatical roles.
Right.
Like subject, object, all that.
Yeah.
Well, Chomsky's point is, even these empty categories,
Okay.
even though they're invisible,
Right.
they still have to play by the rules of case.
So, like, even though a word might be missing,
Yeah,
it still has to act grammatically like it's there.
exactly. He calls this the case filter.
Okay.
Basically says an empty category, it can only exist in a spot where it would normally get case.
Oh, interesting.
Let me give you an example.
Huh.
John seems to like ice cream. Notice how after seems, it doesn't actually say John's the one liking the ice cream.
Right.
But we get it.
Yeah, you just kind of
It's implied, right?
just assume.
Right. And that's our empty category at work.
Okay.
It's standing in for that unspoken John.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing. It can only be there because it's getting nominative case.
Okay.
From the verb seems, if it was somewhere it couldn't get case, the sentence would just sound wrong.
Right.
It'd be ungrammatical.
It'd be totally off.
So even though we don't consciously think about case, it's working in the background.
Like a secret grammar police.
Uh-huh. Exactly. Making sure everything's in order.
I love that.
And this case idea, together with empty categories,
Yeah.
helps us understand some really tricky sentence structures.
It's like, I don't know, it's like this giant puzzle, and we're putting the pieces together.
Yeah.
Okay, so where does government fit into all of this? We talked about it before, but I'm still not quite sure how it connects.
Well, government is a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
It's about the relationship between words in a sentence.
Got it.
How they influence each other.
Okay.
How they control each other grammatically. And it's super important for both case theory and binding theory.
So words can have power over other words.
It's true. It's not just about what's next to what. It's about deeper connections.
That's a cool way to think about it.
Right. Chomsky uses government to explain these subtle differences in how we understand pronouns.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take these two. John expects him to win versus John expects himself to win.
Okay.
In the first one, him could be someone else, right?
Right.
But in the second one, himself has to be John.
That's true.
And that difference comes down to government.
Okay.
How the verb expect is governing the pronoun.
Got it.
Him isn't governed by expect in the same way himself is.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that changes who the pronoun can refer to.
So even though the sentences look similar,
Yeah.
what's happening underneath is different.
Right. It's like one of those optical illusions.
Oh, yeah.
Same image, but two different ways to see it.
And it all comes down to this idea of government.
Right. Which shows us how important the underlying structure is.
Not just the words themselves.
Exactly. Chomsky was all about going beyond the surface,
Yeah.
digging deeper, finding those hidden mechanisms.
It's like he was this linguistic detective.
Huh? He really was. And he was also interested in how these mechanisms vary across languages.
Yeah, because, not all languages work the same way, right?
Right. He talks about this thing called the PRO drop parameter.
Okay.
Some languages, like Spanish, you can drop the subject pronoun
You can just say the verb.
Yeah, so hablo for I speak.
Right.
Totally fine. But in English, you need the I. You can't just say speak.
Right. It sounds weird.
And that's because English, we've got to have that subject explicitly stated.
Yeah.
Whereas Spanish has all these verb endings.
Right.
They carry more information about the subject.
So the pronoun's optional.
Exactly. It makes you realize that what seems natural in one language can be totally different in another.
It's like different languages give us different maps of the world.
That's a great way to put it. Linguists are still figuring out how these variations affect how we think and express ourselves.
Wow. So we've talked about case, government, empty categories, this PRO drop thing. I feel like my brain is on overload here.
That's a lot, right?
But it's so cool. Is there anything else from these lectures that you think is especially mind-blowing?
There is one more thing that really stands out to me, and it ties back to those empty categories in movement.
Okay.
You ready for this? It's the idea of traces.
Traces?
You remember how words can move around in a sentence?
Oh, yeah, like when we make a question.
Exactly. Like, the cat sat on the mat.
Yeah.
We can change it to, where did the cat sit?
Right, and that where moves to the front.
Exactly. Chomsky's idea is that when a word moves,
Okay.
it leaves a trace behind.
A trace?
Like an invisible marker.
So even though it's not there anymore,
Yeah.
it still matters.
It's still influencing how we understand the sentence.
Wow. That's wild.
For example, in that question, where did the cat sit?
Yeah.
The trace of a where tells us we're asking about the location of the sitting.
It's not about something else.
Exactly.
Right.
Without that trace, the question would be super ambiguous.
So even though where moved, it's
Yeah.
still connected.
It's still connected to its original spot.
Through this invisible trace.
Exactly. It's like an echo of the moved word.
It's amazing how much we can learn from something that's not even there.
Right. And this trace idea, it has huge implications.
Yeah.
It forces us to see sentences as these dynamic things, not static structures,
Right.
with words moving around, leaving these invisible clues behind.
It's like they're leaving footprints.
And those footprints, those traces, they guide our interpretation.
I'm really starting to rethink everything I thought I knew about language.
That's great. That's exactly the kind of shift Chomsky wanted.
It's a lot more complex
Yeah.
and a lot more dynamic than I ever realized.
Chomsky was always pushing linguists to see beyond the surface.
To find those hidden roles.
Right. And he even came up with this idea of derivations,
Okay.
which is basically how he sees sentences being built.
Okay.
Like not just as a finished product,
Yeah.
but something that happens in stages.
Oh, interesting.
And you know what? Those traces we were talking about, they play a big role in that process.
So there's a whole other level to this.
Yeah. It's like the sentence we hear or read, it's like the final performance.
Okay.
But there's a whole rehearsal behind it.
I love that analogy.
Right. And those traces are like the stagehand's marks,
Showing us.
showing us where everything moved.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So how do these derivations actually work? Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So how do these derivations actually work? Like what's happening backstage during these rehearsals?
So Chomsky, he talks about different types of movement. One is when movement,
Oh,
which is what's going on when we ask questions.
Right, like our example, where did the cat sit?
Exactly. That where moved from its original spot, leaving that trace.
Okay, and the trace helps us understand what we're asking about.
Right. So then there's something called NP movement.
Okay.
This is where noun phrases move around, often in passive sentences.
Oh, okay.
So like, the ball was hit by the boy. That comes from an active sentence.
Where the boy is doing the hitting,
Exactly. So in the passive one, the ball has moved up to the subject position.
and the boy moved to that phrase after the verb
Right. And again, they leave those
to
traces.
show us where they came from.
Exactly. It's how we connect the active and passive versions.
It's wild how just changing the word order like that.
I know, right?
It seems simple, but there's so much going on underneath.
In Chomsky's theory, it gives us this framework to make sense of it.
Okay.
He lays out these rules, how those movements happen, what structures they make.
So it's not just random, it's systematic.
Exactly. There's a logic to it.
Yeah.
And Chomsky was fascinated by the idea that these rules might be universal.
Like part of how our brains are wired for language.
Right. Part of that innate capacity. And it can help explain why kids learn language so fast.
It's like we're programmed for it.
Yeah, in a way. And his work really sparked this whole area of research on language acquisition.
Like how much is nature versus nurture?
Exactly. How much is innate? How much comes from experience?
So if I'm getting this right, these derivations, they're like the blueprints for building sentences.
It's a good way to think about it.
Words move around, they leave these traces, and there are rules for how it all works.
Right. And those rules, they're part of our linguistic DNA,
Oh,
you know?
it's amazing.
It is. And it all comes back to Chomsky's big focus, right?
Which was?
Uncovering those fundamental principles that govern language. This idea of universal grammar.
So the thing that makes human language possible in the first place.
Exactly.
This has been an incredible journey, really. I feel like I'm seeing language in a whole new light.
That's great to hear. And, this is just scratching the surface.
It
There's
is.
so much more to explore with Chomsky's work.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
Yeah, it's been a good one.
I want to thank you for taking us on this wild ride through these mind-blowing ideas.
Happy to do it anytime.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of Chomsky's theories.
It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. And, we encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring.
Keep that curiosity going.
Because human language, it's truly remarkable.
It is.
The power, the complexity, it's something to marvel at.
Absolutely.